In this lecture video, I'll be talking about the parts and functions of the nervous system. So in general or as a whole, one of the functions of the nervous system is to monitor changes. So much like a sentry, it uses its millions of sensory receptors to monitor changes occurring both inside and outside one's body. So when we say outside our body, it refers to our environment that is perceived by the senses. You have vision, auditory information, touch, olfactory information, and so on. And also it monitors changes inside. So it refers to our internal organs, our heart rate, our respiration, and so on. These changes are called stimuli, and the gathered information is called sensory input. So you will learn in the next chapter how these information are converted into electrochemical information that is processed in the brain. Another function is to interpret these sensory inputs. So it processes and interprets the sensory input and decides what should be done at each moment, a process called integration. So the information received by the senses, by our eyes, our nose, and so on, are meaningless bits of information. So these are converted into electrochemical signals and then processed in the brain, and the brain will interpret what this specific stimulus mean and how should we react to this stimulus. So after giving meaning to the information or the stimulus, it then um, activates a specific response um, through muscles or glands or via motor output. So for example, if you perceive an information to be dangerous, so one of the effect responses might be running from it. So this specific process is a mental activity. So the brain is the center of mental activity, including consciousness, thinking, and memory. So while listening to this lecture video, this is a continuous process of receiving information, interpreting it in the brain, and producing effect responses. So this is now the layout of our nervous system. So it is divided into two divisions. You have the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So in the central nervous system, it is composed of our brain and also the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is composed of the nerves located in the different parts of the body except for the brain and the spinal cord. So in the central nervous system, you're able to do complex and incredible cognitive functions. You're able to think, to speak, to read, you're able to comprehend, feel, see, hear in the central nervous system. In the peripheral division, you are able to move your muscles to receive sensation from the different parts of your body and perform many other bodily functions. So this division is divided into two. You have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is responsible for the interaction with the external environment. So when we say external environment, those things or information outside one's body. So it is responsible for sensory input. So the information received by the senses, so what we can see, what we can touch, what we can hear. And after the brain interprets it, the somatic also produces the motor output, or it controls the skeletal muscles in order for us to be able to move and perform other bodily functions. The other division, the autonomic one, so if the somatic is responsible for the external environment, the autonomic is responsible for internal environment, meaning within the internal organs. So it regulates our heart rate, our breathing, you have our blood pressure, digestion, hormone secretions, and other functions. This division is further subdivided into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So in the sympathetic division, it is triggered by threatening or challenging physical or psychological information. It prepares our body for action. And the parasympathetic division is responsible for returning the body into a more relaxed state. And it also regulates our digestion. This is another representation of our nervous system. So if you can notice here, especially in the peripheral division, the somatic and the autonomic are composed of nerves. Nerves are referred to as bundles of axons. Um, and there are two types of nerves. You have afferent nerves and efferent nerves. So when we say afferent nerves, they carry nerve impulses approaching the brain. So afferent approaching the brain. And efferent nerves, meaning they escape the brain, so they carry nerve impulses away from the brain and towards the muscles or other senses. So in the somatic nervous system, the afferent nerves carry information or carry nerve impulses coming from the five senses towards the central nervous system or approaching the brain. And the efferent nerves are carrying nerve impulses from the brain. It escapes the brain and it sends towards the skeletal muscles for necessary movement. For the autonomic nervous system, the afferent is sending nerve impulses from the internal organs approaching the brain, and the efferent nerves are sending information from the brain, uh, and that information escapes the brain and towards the internal organs. So just to clarify between afferent, efferent meaning, or think of the word letter A, so afferent approaching the brain, efferent nerves, letter E escaping the brain and towards the muscles. So we will go into more details now regarding the functions of the nervous system, especially its parts. So once again, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So again, you're able to do and perform complex cognitive functions in the central nervous system. So you have imagination, anticipation, planning, understanding, and other functions that only humans can do. Um, From the bottom of the brain emerges the spinal cord, which is made up of neurons and also bundles of axons or nerves and dendrites that carry information back and forth between the brain and the body. So basically, the spinal cord is like a very smart relay station. And the peripheral system, so you're able to move your muscles, receive sensations from your body, perform many other bodily functions. So it's located outside the skull and spine, and it serves to bring information into the CNS or the central nervous system and carry signals out of the central nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, it includes all the nerves that which are located throughout the body except in the brain and in the spinal cord. So it carries messages to and from different muscles or glands, sense organs that is located all throughout the body. So again, the somatic system is a division of the peripheral system. So it consists of a network of nerves that connects either to sensory receptors or to muscles that you can move voluntarily, such as your muscles in your limbs, your back, neck, and chest. It also consists of the afferent, again, afferent information approaching the brain, and efferent information or nerve impulses escaping the brain and towards the muscles. So again, the somatic system is the one that interacts with our external environment. How do we respond to our outside information? And the autonomic system is responsible for our heart rate, our breathing, blood pressure, digestion, hormone secretions, and other functions. So they consist of neurons that receive information from and send commands to the heart, intestines, and other internal organs. So again, they are responsible for um, our internal environment. So this system detects changes in our in our internal environment. And it has two parts, namely the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So one division of the autonomic system is the sympathetic division or the sympathetic nervous system, a network of nerves that prepares the organs for vigorous activity, consists of chains of ganglia. Ganglia are these are structures containing cell bodies of neurons. just to the left and right of the spinal cord central regions, the thoracic and lumbar areas. So here. So the nerves of the sympathetic division are most likely located in the thoracic and the lumbar area. These ganglia are connected by axons to the spinal cord, and the sympathetic axons prepare the organs for the fight or flight response. So it increases our breathing, um, our heart rate, and decreases digestive activity. So the sympathetic division is triggered by challenging or threatening physical or psychological arousal, and it prepares our body for action. So let's say, for example, if you are watching a scary movie and then your physiological you have aroused physiological responses, so you are in a state of in a fight flight response, so your sympathetic division is triggered. Or for example, so any situation that you perceive as stressful or challenging or threatening, it could be, for example, an oral exam. So your sympathetic division is active if you perceive or if you um, interpret an oral exam as a threatening or challenging situation. So the fight or flight response, its effect is increase in respiratory rate, blood is shunted away from our digestive tract, it's directed into our muscles or limbs, um, our awareness intensifies, our sight sharpens, our impulses quicken, our perception of pain diminishes, our immune system mobilizes with increased activation. So we are physically and psychologically prepared to fight or flight. So we scan and search our environment looking for the enemy. So it is also have an evolutionary basis, because if we are at the height of our senses, we are more likely to focus more on the threatening event. And if we redirect all our attention to the threatening event, then it allows us to prepare for necessary actions that is of course essential for our survival. Another part of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic division. So it facilitates non-emergency responses. So basically, it returns the body to a calmer state and is involved in digestion. Parasympathetic activities are related to and generally the opposite of sympathetic activities. So they project from the brain and the sacral, this region of the spinal cord. So if the sympathetic division is here, the thoracic area and the lumbar area, the parasympathetic nerves is in the sacral area. So this system conserves energy as it slows the heart rate, it increases intestinal and gland activity, it relaxes the muscles, okay, so it returns the body into a normal, in a balanced and relaxed state. So it conserves energy. So this is a summary of the difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. So the parasympathetic division controls homeostasis or balance in the body. The sympathetic activates the body's fight or flight response for threatening and challenging situations. Parasympathetic, body's rest and digest response. The sympathetic controls body's response during perceived threat. Parasympathetic, longer pathways, that's why it's lower. The sympathetic has a very short neuron, that's why the conduction of signals is also faster. The parasympathetic counterbalances and restores the body to a state of calmness, and the sympathetic division, it speeds up bodily responses, tenses up, it becomes, or it allows us to be more alert. So these are some of the functions that the two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, is responsible for. Okay, again, if you are in a very stressful or threatening environment, the sympathetic division, for example, it dilates the pupil. So, mudako ato ang pupil. So, if mudako atong pupil, it allows more light to come in for us to really see properly what the situation or what the threatening situation is all about. Um, It also inhibits salivation. So muna if you notice if nakulbaan mo or if you're very anxious, kanang maughan og tutunlan, okay? But if ma-okay na pod, if ma-normal na ang situation, stimulate na po na balik sa parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division also is responsible for increase in heart rate. So for an efficient flow of blood in the body. So mutaas imong blood pressure ani nga time. Another is it inhibits digestive activity. So muna if na anxious, if nakulbaan kay dili hilisan, no? So and again, if the situation returns to normal, the parasympathetic division stimulates digestive activity. The sympathetic division also stimulates glucose release by the liver. Glucose, this is the energy for the brain. Sugar, kanang term nga sugar rush. Another function is it stimulates epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are neurotransmitters. You learn more about neurotransmitters in the next chapter, no, in the neural conduction. But these are referred to as stress hormones. So ma-release siya during in a heightened state. So other functions for the sympathetic division, it relaxes the bladder. The parasympathetic contracts it. The sympathetic is also involved in when we experience orgasm or ejaculation. So as what you have learned so far, diba, the peripheral nervous system basically is composed of nerves, and most of the nerves project from the spinal cord. However, there are 12 pairs of exceptions. So 12 pairs of nerves that are not projecting from the spinal cord but projects from the brain, and hence they are referred as cranial nerves. The functions of the various cranial nerves are commonly assessed by neurologists as basis for diagnosis. So these are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves and their various locations on the brain. But we're not going to be very technical about this, no, just to give you an information nga naapoy nerves that are projecting from the brain. And they have specific functions. And these are the specific functions. So for example, olfactory nerve, the function is smell. The test used is to identify odors with eyes closed and so on. And these nerves are important for neurologists because as you can notice, the functions here are very specific. So damage in a particular nerve or damage in a particular function could give information to the neuroscientist or neurologist what nerves might be responsible for this illness or this disorder. And with that, necessary treatments or interventions can be then conceptualized. So, because the brain is a very important part of our humanity, so that is why certain mechanisms are there to protect it. So, the CNS is encased in bone and covered by three meninges. So, the dura mater, the arachnoid membrane, and the pia mater. So, the dura mater is the hard or the tough outer membrane, the arachnoid membrane, the web-like, that's why it's termed as arachnoid, and the pia mater, which adheres to CNS surface. In the subarachnoid space, this contains large blood vessels as well as the CSF rather, or the cerebrospinal fluid. So the purpose of the CSF is to cushion the brain within the skull. It's also serve as a shock absorber for the central nervous system. It also circulates nutrients and chemicals filtered from the blood and also removes the waste products from the brain. Occasionally, the flow of the CSF is blocked by, for example, a tumor near one of the ventricles. So the resulting buildup of fluid in the ventricles causes the walls of the ventricles and thus the entire brain to expand. And the resulting condition is hydrocephalus. In the previous slide, that was more on the physical protection of the brain, so you have the skull, the meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid. But there is also a chemical protection, and it is referred to as the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is basically a mechanism that impedes the passage of many toxic substances from the blood into the brain. So these are tightly packed cells of blood vessel walls and prevent entry of many molecules. So if a normal blood vessel or a blood vessel that is not found in the brain, its walls are not as tightly packed as in the brain. So because of the tight packed walls of the blood vessels, it protects the brain from the passage of many toxic substances. A separate discussion of the blood-brain barrier is in a separate video in this module, so be sure to check that out as well. So now let's talk about the brain cell, or in other words, the neuron. So I'm sure you have encountered this in your Psych 1101, but let's just review the parts and functions just briefly. So let's start with the dendrites. So dendrites are branch-like extensions in the neuron. So they receive signals from other cells. Okay. And once it is received by the dendrites, it travels in the cell body. So the cell body organizes and keeps the cell functional. And from the cell body, it goes to the axon hillock, which generates the impulse of the neuron, and then towards the axon. So the axon transfers signals to other cells and other organs. So this is the axon. No? Some axons can be very long. Some extends from 1 meter or more, or some neurons don't even have an axon. Okay. And then in the axon, there's a covering we call the myelin sheath. So the purpose of the myelin sheath is for the nerve impulse to travel efficiently. Also, to increase the speed of the signal. And the myelin sheath, is produced by the Schwann cells. So these are the Schwann cells. So in between the myelin sheaths, there are the nodes of Ranvier. So they allow diffusion of ions. So if you can remember the action potential, wherein there is an exchange of sodium ions and potassium ions. So anyway, you will learn more about how nerve impulses travel in the neuron and what are the chemical processes involved with it in the next chapter, which is all about neural conduction. So yes, that is the basic this is the basic parts and functions of the neuron. There are also different classes of neurons. So you have a unipolar neuron, bipolar, multipolar, and an interneuron. So in naming them, we based it on the processes or projections in the cell body of the neuron. So this is the cell body and how many processes or projections are there. So in a unipolar neuron, only one projection. So this one. So the dendrites and the axon. In a bipolar neuron, there are two processes or projections in the cell body. So you have one, two. And the most common type or class of neuron is the multipolar neuron, wherein multiple projections or extensions or processes are found in the cell body of the neuron. There are also neurons without axons. So if wala man sila axon, they cannot conduct signals from one structure to another, but their function is to integrate the neural activity within a single brain structure. Aside from neurons, there are also other cells in the central nervous system, and it is called as glial cells. So their basic functions is to nourish and insulate the neurons in order to prevent interference from other electrical signals. It also directs the growth of neurons and support mature neurons. It removes waste products that influence the growth of neurons. And there are certain or different types of glial cells. So you have oligodendrocytes, okay, the blue one. The oligodendrocytes, you have the microglia, the brown one, and astrocytes, the green one. And although it's not here, it's not visible here, but another type is the Schwann cells. So there are four major classifications of glial cells. So the first classification is called, or we refer to them as oligodendrocytes. Okay, so if you notice, this is a separate neuron, the kining yellow neuron. So the oligodendrocytes wraps, no, the extension wraps around the axons of the neuron here. And most usually they wrap to multiple neurons. Okay, and these extensions are rich in myelin. Okay, so they form the myelin sheaths in neurons. Again, so the purpose of the myelin sheath is for the efficient transmissions of signals. Another somewhat similar function with the oligodendrocytes are the Schwann cells. So the Schwann cell constitutes one myelin segment, whereas each oligodendrocyte provides several myelin segments, often on more than one axon. So if you see in this picture, again, Kenisha, this is an oligodendrocyte, and this one is an axon of a neuron, another axon of a separate neuron, and a third one, another axon of a separate neuron. So one oligodendrocyte, and it connects or wraps around the axons of several neurons. Okay, so but for the Schwann cell here in this picture, only one. Okay, one segment, one myelin segment, one Schwann cell. So both produces myelin sheath, wherein it speeds up again the transmission of the nerve impulses. The Schwann cells are mainly located in or restricted in the peripheral nervous system. The oligodendrocytes are found on the central nervous system, but the Schwann cells is the myelination in the peripheral nervous system. And only Schwann cells can guide axonal regeneration or regrowth after damage. So in other words, ang mga oligodendrocytes, dili niya ma-repair if there is an axonal damage. So that is why effective axonal regeneration in the mammalian nervous system is only restricted to the peripheral nervous system. Kay ang Schwann cell raman ang naay capability for axonal regeneration. And this is found on the peripheral. The oligodendrocytes kay wala siya capability for regeneration of the axons, and this is found on the central nervous system. Another type is the microglia. So from the word micro, so this is the smallest type of glial cell. So in this picture, here, kind of brown one, this is the microglia. They respond to injury or disease by multiplying, engulfing cellular debris, and triggering other inflammatory responses. So basically, they support and nourish the neuron. So another classification is or are the astrocytes. So they are the largest glial cells. They allow the passage of some chemicals from the blood into the central nervous system, into the neurons, and in blocking other chemicals, other harmful chemicals. It was recently discovered that it is also shown to send and receive signals from neurons in other glial cells. It modulates neural activity. It also controls and maintains the synapses and maintain the function of axons. So recent research in glial cells in general are also trying to discovering if certain damages in the glial cells can have implications on behavior, because at first it was originally thought that glial cells only support and nourish the neuron, but again it was later found out that they can also send and receive signals from neurons and other glial cells. So let's go now to the major parts or major divisions of our brain. In this picture, it shows the development of the brain in the embryo. But let's just make this as simple as possible. In the first part, the brain and the spinal cord begins, mura na sila neural tube. Okay, so ang forma niya is tube. And then, after 3 to 4 weeks in the embryo, letter A, So the neural tube becomes or musho siya og swellings, or we call them the three primary brain vesicles. So one swelling, the second swelling, the third swelling. So it is called the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon, or more commonly known as the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And after 5 weeks in the embryo, the first projection or protrusion or swelling would be further subdivided into two. So you have the metencephalon and myelencephalon. So these two further comprise the hindbrain. The midbrain or the mesencephalon stays the same, and the forebrain or the prosencephalon divides or further develops into two more swellings, namely the telencephalon and the diencephalon. So we'll start here, no, in the pinakaubos, or we call that the posterior part, sa pinakalayo nga part sa brain, because this is the primitive brain in this area. Okay. The myelencephalon is also called as the medulla. The mesencephalon contains the pons and the cerebellum. The mesencephalon is the midbrain. The diencephalon contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and also the epithalamus. And the telencephalon is the cortex or the cerebrum. So these are the 5 major divisions, and the 5 major divisions are based on the swellings or the vesicles in the development of the embryo. So this is now the prototype of an adult human brain. So the myelencephalon, it's also called as the medulla, so it's located in this portion of the brain. The metencephalon contains the pons and the cerebellum, and collectively these two are referred to as the hindbrain. The mesencephalon, this is the reward center, the reward and pleasure center of the brain. It's also called the midbrain in this portion. The diencephalon, which contains the hypothalamus, and the thalamus is located in this portion. And the telencephalon is also referred to as the cortex. And these two are collectively called as the forebrain. The telencephalon, also known as the neocortex, neo meaning new, it is new in the sense that this part of the brain started developing when primates came into the scene. When we are speaking evolutionarily, because this area here, the hindbrain, or the and also the mesencephalon is the primitive part of the brain, because some animals don't have a cortex, or their cortex are not well developed. So because the cortex enables us to do cognitive or complex cognitive functioning, such as imagination, problem solving, decision making, and so on. So in this picture, you can see the medulla, or it's also referred or called as the myelencephalon. So in this portion, okay, so this is composed largely of tracts carrying signals between the rest of the brain and the body. And if you can notice, inside the medulla, there's a reticular formation, this one. So this includes a group of cells that control vital reflexes such as respiration, heart rate, and also blood pressure, mainly controlled. These functions are again mainly controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The next division is the metencephalon. So this is the metencephalon here. So you have the parts of it are the pons, this one, and the cerebellum. So pons, it means bridge, a bridge to interconnect messages between the spinal cord and the brain. It also makes chemicals involved in sleeping or in sleep. The cerebellum, this one, it is involved in coordinating motor movements, so our balance and coordination, but not in initiating voluntary movements, because initiation of voluntary movements is located in the motor cortex, and it is located in the frontal lobe, which we will discuss later. But for cerebellum, this is more on balance and coordination. It's also involved in performing timed motor responses. You have such as those in playing games or sports, in an automatic reflexive learning, such as blinking the eye. And more recently, it was also found that the cerebellum is also involved in cognitive functioning, because there was a study wherein damage in the cerebellum had implications on decision making and the use of language. So this goes to show, or this is suggestive of the idea that the cerebellum is not only limited to motor movements or coordinating motor movements, but nasa siya part giplay sa cognitive functioning. The midbrain, or the mesencephalon, is located in this part or portion of the brain, and it is responsible, or it is considered as the reward pleasure center of the brain. It's stimulated by food, sex, money, music, looking at attractive faces, some drugs. It has areas for visual and auditory reflexes, such as automatically turning your head towards a noise. So if you notice, the myelencephalon, the metencephalon, and the mesencephalon, its function are for basic survival. You have motivational behaviors such as food, sex, hunger, chemicals involved in sleep, or it regulates our heart rate, our blood pressure, our respiration, and so on. So that's why it's called the primitive brain. And the cortex later on developed when primates came into the scene. But it's also good to remember, or to take into consideration, that it's wrong, no? It's really wrong to think that this part of the brain kay mura gyud ang function. If, for example, looking at attractive faces is really in the midbrain ra gyud na siya exclusively, no? So the brain is a very complicated structure, and despite the modern advances in the study, there are still lots, no, to discover inside the human brain. So do not think of the human brain as separate functional units. Like for example, if ang emotion and kay diri ra jud nga specific part, reflexes diri ra jud nga specific part, no? So you don't think that way, but think of it as the brain as working as a whole. But of course, there are some areas for educational purposes. There are some areas that are correlated or associated with specific behaviors. But again, it's wrong to think that it is exclusively, no, that a specific behavior is exclusive on this particular area. And if you also try to see videos on functional magnetic resonance imaging, you would notice that when speaking, lots of areas of the brain are functioning, not just the cortex responsible for speech, but also other areas of the brain. Okay, so do not view it as separate functional units. Another structure is the diencephalon, which is composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So this is the left and right thalamus. Okay, and the function is involved in receiving sensory information, doing some initial processing, and the relaying of the sensory information to other areas of the cortex. So for example, if the thalamus receives information about vision, then the thalamus relays it to the visual cortex of the brain. If the thalamus receives auditory information, then sends it to the primary auditory cortex. The hypothalamus, this regulates many motivational behaviors. You have eating, drinking, sexual responses, emotional behaviors such as arousing the body when fighting or fleeing. So it controls the autonomic nervous system. So damage in the hypothalamus might have implications to our emotional behaviors, our eating habits, okay, and so on. The fifth division is the cortex. So this part, or the cerebrum, it's also another name. It's responsible for an incredible number of complex functions. So in other words, the cortex makes us human, because it involves learning, memory. It also houses our personality, who we are, our self-concept, our aspirations in life, what do we want to become in the future, functions involved in language, speaking, our emotional responses, interpretation of events, experiencing sensations, initiating voluntary movements, planning, and decision making or our choices. Again, this is the neocortex. This developed later part, no, when primates came into the scene, the cortex also developed, and this enabled us to perform a variety, a wide array of cognitive functions. The cortex or the telencephalon, or also called as the cerebrum, is divided into four lobes. Okay, so you have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is the largest of the four lobes of the brain. So this is located at the front part. So this one. So it serves to function as in initiating voluntary movements, interpreting emotional or performing emotional behaviors, behaving normally in social situations, maintaining a healthy personality, paying attention to things in the environment, making decisions, and executing plans. So this is like the command center, or much like the duties of a company's executive officer. So that is the function of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe also houses the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is involved in the initiation of voluntary movement. So if you can remember earlier, the cerebellum is responsible for the coordination of this voluntary movements. But the one who initiates it is the motor cortex, and it is located in the frontal lobe. So damage in the frontal lobe, disruptions of personality, you have emotional swings, problems in focusing your attention, in remembering, imong decision making, maapektahan sad, how you plan and how you organize. So the very famous American railroad construction foreman, Phineas Gage. So I think there was an explosion, and then um, a iron rod was driven completely through his head, destroying much of his brain's left frontal lobe. And for that, his friends reported effects on his personality. So, ingon iyang friends nga, he is not, he's a different person, or he's no longer the Phineas Gage we know. The parietal lobe is located behind the frontal lobe. It functions in processing sensory information from body parts, which includes touching, locating position of limbs, and feeling temperature and pain. Also attending to perceiving and analyzing objects in space. So an example of its function is it allows us, diba, for example, there are two objects in your pockets. One is a pencil and another is a coin. So even without using visual information, bisag dili ka mo tan-aw, just by touching it, just by feeling them, you could tell, of course, asa man ang pencil, asa ang coin. So that's because of our parietal lobe. So again, also responsible for temperature and the experience of pain. The experience of pain, evolutionarily speaking, that's very important because pain allows you to survive. It signals your body that, or it signals you that something bad is happening in your body. So take care of it as soon as possible. The parietal lobe also houses the somatosensory cortex. So in this picture, this is the motor cortex of the frontal lobe, and this is the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. So it processes sensory information about touch, location of limbs, pain, and temperature. So right receives the left side of the body and left from right. Because as you can remember, the right hemisphere controls the left side of our body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of our body. So ang crossing kay sa pons na siya, no, sa bridge na siya mahitabo when the nerves cross. So damage in the somatosensory cortex would have implications on your ability to feel pain or the ability to um, feel objects. Okay. The temporal lobe is located directly below the parietal lobe, and it involves in hearing, speaking coherently, and understanding verbal and written material. The temporal lobe contains the Broca's area and the vernix area. So the Broca's area is responsible for speech production. So it combines sounds into words and it arranges them into meaningful sentences. The vernix area is responsible for speaking in coherent sentences and for understanding speech or comprehension. So damage in these areas, we call them aphasia. So Broca's aphasia, damage in the Broca's area, would have implications in speech production. I mean, you can understand what the person is talking to you, what the person means. However, you cannot form meaningful sentences, or the sounds you produce are just random, no? Or wala siya meaning. Pero makasabot ka sa istorya nimo. In the vernix area, um, damage in this area has implications on understanding. So dili ka kasabot. But you can produce sentences, you can produce words. But for the reason nga dili ka kasabot, even though fluent ka og words, however, the sentences you form, no matter how fluent they may sound, they end up being meaningless. Or kay di mo makakasabot sa istorya. So ang imong baws sa storya dili pod masabtan. But makastorya ka sa exact word, no? Unlike the Broca's aphasia. The temporal lobe contains the association areas, the auditory association area. So if the frontal lobe has the motor cortex for initiating voluntary movements, the parietal contains the somatosensory cortex. This includes the perception of pain, temperature, touching, and feeling functions, while the temporal lobe is for auditory information. So the primary auditory cortex receives electrical signals from the ears and transform these signals into meaningless sound sensations. And the one or the structure that makes it coherent is the auditory association area. So from the word association, iyang i-associate ang mga stimuli nga na-receive sa primary auditory cortex. The occipital lobe, okay, it processes visual information, so it includes seeing colors, perceiving and recognizing objects, animals, and people. And nalocate ang visual cortex. So the visual cortex is responsible for, or it receives electrical signals coming from the receptors in the eye and transforms these signals into meaningless basic visual associations such as lights, lines, shadows, colors, and texture. The one that will, or the structure that will make these random or meaningless basic visual sensation into something meaningful is the visual association area. So same, no, with the temporal area, the primary auditory cortex kay meaningless, and then ang auditory association area maoy mo combines meaningless sounds into something that can be perceived. Same with the occipital lobe, the visual association area transforms the sensations, the lights, the lines, and the shadows into something that is meaningful. Perception of people, objects, and animals. So those are the major lobes of the cortex. And please remember not to view them as separate functional units. No? So dili na siya buot pasabot nga kung personality na ara gyud na sa frontal lobe. Like if I'm processing visual information, ang active ra gyud na is the occipital lobe. No? So no, it doesn't work that way, but it's more on being interrelated. Okay, so it just so happened that according to studies, when we are processing visual information, for example, most likely an active good is the occipital lobe. But that does not mean that the only active part is the occipital lobe, and so on. Okay, so do not view them as functional units. So they are interrelated, and the brain works cohesively in processing different types of information. So again, these are the 5 major divisions of the brain. You have the myelencephalon, or the medulla, the metencephalon, which includes the pons and the cerebellum, the mesencephalon, or the midbrain, the diencephalon, which contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and the telencephalon, which is the, or called also as the cortex or the cerebrum. So the medulla and the metencephalon can be classified as the hindbrain, the mesencephalon, the midbrain, the diencephalon, and the telencephalon can be classified as the forebrain. So that ends our discussion on the anatomy of the nervous system. Please also view the videos that follow, specifically on the blood-brain barrier and the limbic system. If you have further concerns, questions, or other clarifications, you may ask your respective instructors.